They laughed when she first stepped onto the training ground. The rifles lined neatly on the table looked heavier than she did, and the men who had already spent weeks lifting weights and running drills smirked as if the whole scene was some kind of joke. "She can't handle a rifle," one of them muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, and another chuckled, nodding in agreement. It was not the first time she had heard such words, and it would not be the last. But inside her chest, the fire that had carried her this far flared brighter. She had not come all this way to prove them right. She was there to prove to herself that she was capable, that strength was not measured by the bulk of arms or the depth of a voice, but by the persistence in one's spirit. Her name was Alina, and for as long as she could remember, she had been underestimated. Growing up in a small town, she had always been smaller, quieter, and quicker to observe than to shout. Her father had once been a marksman in the service, but he passed away when she was young, leaving her only with fragments of memory, his steady hands cleaning the long barrel of his rifle, the faint smell of gun oil, and the sharp crack of practice shots echoing over the fields. Those fragments had planted a seed deep inside her. Where others thought she would shrink into the shadows of doubt, she carried those sounds and images with her as a reminder that precision and patience often mattered more than brute force. And so, when the time came for recruits to test themselves, she stepped forward, determined to honor not just her father's memory but her own resolve. The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Captain Rhodes, eyed her with skepticism. He had trained dozens of soldiers over the years, and he knew the weight of the rifle was more than just steel and wood. It demanded control, discipline, and strength that most recruits failed to master quickly. As Alina picked up the rifle for the first time, her arms trembled slightly. The men around her snickered again, and she could feel their stares burning into her back, but she locked her jaw and adjusted her grip. Her father's words echoed in her memory, words she had heard only once before he was gone. "It's not about fighting the weapon, it's about becoming part of it. Steady breath, steady hands, steady mind." She inhaled, slow and deep, and then exhaled as if to push out the weight of every doubting voice around her. The first target stood about 30 yards away, painted with a bright red circle at its center. The others had already taken their shots earlier in the morning, some missing by wide margins, others nicking the outer rings. Only a few had managed direct hits, and those were celebrated with claps on the back and shouts of approval. For Alina there was no celebration waiting. There was only silence and the heavy expectation that she would fail. She raised the rifle, her cheek pressed firmly against the stock, her finger resting lightly against the trigger. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade, the whispers, the laughter, even the sound of her own heartbeat. All that remained was the target, still and patient, as if daring her to prove herself. The shot rang out, sharp and echoing. For half a second there was no reaction, and then a small puff of dust appeared dead center in the target's circle. The silence that followed was heavier than the rifle in her hands. No one cheered, no one clapped, but the smirks faltered. She lowered the rifle, her face calm, though inside she felt a surge of adrenaline. That first hit was more than just a mark on a wooden board, it was a crack in the wall of doubt that had been built around her since the beginning. She could feel it breaking piece by piece. "Beginner's luck," one of the recruits muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Alina didn't respond. She didn't need to. Captain Rhodes stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, and studied the target through his binoculars. He gave no expression, no nod of approval, but his silence was its own statement. He had expected failure, and instead he had witnessed precision. Turning back, he barked at the others to prepare for the next round, but Alina could sense that the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter had grown quieter, replaced by an uneasy awareness that perhaps she was not as fragile as they wanted to believe. She reloaded, her movements careful but not hesitant. Each click and slide of metal felt natural, almost familiar, as though the memory of her father's hands was guiding hers. The next target was farther, and the wind picked up slightly, tugging at her loose strands of hair. She steadied her breath again, ignoring the sting of dust against her eyes. This time she did not feel nervous. She felt focused, sharp, like the world had narrowed once again to just her and the small circle painted on wood. The second shot cracked through the air, and once again the target bore a perfect mark. This time, the silence was broken not by laughter, but by a low whistle of disbelief from one of the men standing behind her. 2 shots. 2 hits. And still, she was just getting started. The sun climbed higher over the training grounds, its heat pressing down on the recruits as if to test not just their endurance but their very will to remain standing. Sweat trickled down Alina's forehead, but her grip did not falter. The rifle felt less foreign in her hands now, as though with each shot she was carving away the layers of doubt that others had draped upon her. Around her, the men were shifting uneasily. Some had begun to realize that what they were witnessing was not luck, not chance, but the steady unfolding of discipline sharpened by quiet determination. She had taken 2 shots and both had landed where many had failed. The line between ridicule and respect was beginning to blur, though none were ready to admit it aloud. Captain Rhodes gave no praise, his eyes hidden behind the gleam of his binoculars, but he had not looked away since her first shot. His years of service had taught him to distinguish chance from skill, and he knew already that what Alina carried was not mere fortune. He could see the steadiness in her breathing, the precision in her stance, and most of all, the absence of panic in her eyes. There was calm there, the kind of calm he had seen only in seasoned marksmen who had weathered the chaos of the battlefield. Still he said nothing, for words were cheap and bullets were truth. The third target was placed farther than the last, its red circle barely visible against the bright glare of the sun. For most recruits, the distance alone was enough to cause trembling hands and shallow breaths. Alina crouched slightly, adjusting her footing in the gravel, and let the rifle rest firmly against her shoulder. She felt the weight of the weapon but no longer feared it. Instead, she allowed it to anchor her, to ground her against the chatter and movement that buzzed around her. When she exhaled this time, the world fell silent again, and her fingers squeezed the trigger in a movement so smooth it was as if she had done it 1,000 times before. The shot cracked, the recoil jolted her shoulder, and a heartbeat later the target center erupted with a perfect mark. This time there was no hiding the reaction. A few recruits muttered under their breaths, one even swore softly, and another kicked at the ground with frustration. It was one thing to see someone succeed once, even twice, but 3 perfect shots in a row carried the weight of undeniable skill. Alina lowered the rifle slowly, her face still calm, but inside she felt the rush of vindication. The fire in her chest burned hotter, not because she wanted to embarrass those who doubted her, but because each shot proved to herself that she belonged here. The line of targets stretched farther down the range, each one set at increasing distances. For the rest of the morning the recruits were cycled through in turns. Some struck close to their marks, others barely clipped the boards, and a few failed entirely. Alina's turn came again, and with every shot she silenced the whispers a little more. 4th target, hit. 5th target, hit. By the 6th, even Captain Rhodes lowered his binoculars for a moment, glancing at her with a look that was neither disbelief nor amusement, but something closer to respect. He still said nothing, yet his silence no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like recognition. By the time she reached the 10th target, her body was beginning to feel the strain. Her arms ached faintly from the repeated recoil, and her eyes stung from focusing so hard under the glare of the sun. But she refused to let weakness creep in. Each time she felt the tremor in her muscles, she remembered her father's steady hands, the way he had once shown her how to align the sights of a small hunting rifle in the woods behind their home. She remembered how he told her that a weapon does not serve the impatient, that only those who could command their breath could command their aim. Those memories were not just lessons, they were fuel. And with that fuel she pressed on. The 11th target shattered the last of the doubt among her fellow recruits. When her bullet struck dead center once again, the silence that followed was no longer heavy with skepticism but charged with awe. No one muttered about luck anymore. No one dared laugh. Even the ones who had mocked her at the beginning now watched with tight jaws, perhaps even with the sting of envy. Alina did not look at them. She had no interest in their approval. Her eyes stayed on the targets, one after the other, as if the world itself had narrowed into this single test of will. As she prepared for the 12th, her heart pounded harder. Not from fear but from the weight of the moment. She knew she was approaching something few could claim, the ability to sustain precision over and over, to break through the limits of endurance and doubt. She steadied herself again, blocking out the heat, the fatigue, the ache in her muscles. Her breath came slow, her mind clear. The rifle cracked, the bullet flew, and once more the target bore her mark. A ripple of disbelief ran through the group, and for the first time, Captain Rhodes allowed himself a small nod. It was barely perceptible, but Alina caught it in the corner of her eye. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she would receive, and it was enough. The 13th target stood even farther, its circle faint, almost swallowed by distance. This was where many recruits had failed earlier, their shots going wide, their confidence crumbling. Alina felt the fatigue creeping in, her shoulders heavy, her vision blurred slightly at the edges. But she refused to give in. She adjusted her stance again, shifted the rifle, and waited for her breath to steady. When the shot rang out, it seemed to echo longer than the rest, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Then, a faint puff at the very center of the target. Perfect once again. The murmurs behind her grew louder now, not of doubt but of awe and disbelief. She had crossed the line from proving herself to rewriting their expectations entirely. Alina reloaded again, the motion slow but steady, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. She knew there were still 2 more to go. 2 more, and the test that began with laughter could end with silence powerful enough to echo for years. The 14th target stood waiting at a distance that made even the most confident recruits hesitate. It was smaller now in the line of sight, a faint red dot against the pale boards, the kind of target that tested not only accuracy but endurance of mind and body. Alina could feel the tremor in her shoulders growing, each shot she had taken before leaving a trace of fatigue in her muscles. Her arms ached, her fingers stiffened slightly from the constant grip, and the sun had burned her skin into a raw heat that made every movement heavier. Yet her eyes never wavered. She knew that the final 2 targets would not be measured by the strength of her body but by the steadiness of her will. She raised the rifle again, ignoring the small protests from her muscles. The butt of the weapon pressed firmly into her shoulder, and the familiar cold of the trigger brushed against her finger. Around her, silence had settled like a blanket. There was no more laughter, no muttering, no careless words from those who had mocked her. Every recruit had their eyes locked on her now, some with disbelief, some with a growing respect, and others with quiet envy. Even Captain Rhodes, who had mastered the art of hiding every emotion behind a hard stare, leaned slightly forward as if unwilling to miss even the smallest detail. Alina's breath came slow and measured. She had learned to drown out the noise of doubt long ago, but this silence was different. This silence was heavy with expectation, and with it came a pressure unlike any she had felt before. The 14th shot would not just be about proving herself, it would be about breaking through the limits they all believed existed. She exhaled, steady and controlled, and in that moment, everything aligned. The rifle cracked, the recoil jolted against her aching body, and a second later the target revealed her answer. Dead center. 14 in a row. The reaction was immediate. A few recruits gasped openly, others cursed under their breath, and 1 or 2 even clapped before realizing where they were. But Alina did not lower her rifle with triumph. She lowered it with the same calm that had carried her through each shot before. Inside, however, her heart thundered. 14. She had done what none of them believed possible. Only 1 remained. The 15th target was the farthest of them all, a speck against the horizon that looked more like an illusion than something tangible. Even seasoned shooters would have called it a challenge, the kind that demanded not just skill but near perfection. Alina's body screamed with exhaustion now, every nerve alight with the demand to rest, but she knew rest would mean surrender. She had not carried herself through this trial, through the jeers and the doubts and the sweat, to stop 1 step before the end. She had promised herself silently at the very beginning that she would not stop until every target bore her mark. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the memory of her father guide her one last time. She saw him crouched beside her in the fading light of a long-ago evening, his voice calm as he told her that the secret to any shot was not in the strength of her hands but in the quiet of her heart. Stillness, Alina. Find the stillness inside you and the rest will follow. When she opened her eyes again, the noise of her fatigue fell away, and all that remained was the distant circle waiting for her. Her arms shook as she lifted the rifle, but she anchored herself against the earth, her stance firm despite the strain. She aligned the sights, blinked away the sweat dripping into her eyes and inhaled deeply. The air felt heavy in her lungs but she held it, steadying herself for one last breath. When she exhaled, the world seemed to grow silent again, and her finger moved with the kind of patience that only comes from surrendering everything to the moment. The shot rang out, sharper than all the rest, as if the air itself knew this was the one that mattered most. The recoil sent a jolt through her tired body, but she held firm, refusing to let the rifle drag her down. A long second passed, then another. The recruits leaned forward, eyes straining, breaths held. And then, as if the world itself confirmed what they all doubted, the 15th target bore its mark. Dead center. Perfect. For a moment, the range was silent. No one moved, no one spoke, as if reality itself had frozen. Then the sound of disbelief broke through, the rush of voices, the scattered claps, even a shout or 2 from those who could no longer contain their astonishment. The very same recruits who had mocked her now stared as though she had done the impossible, which, in their eyes, she had. Alina lowered the rifle slowly, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, but her face remained calm. Inside, however, her spirit roared. 15 targets, 15 perfect hits. She had turned their laughter into silence, their doubt into awe. Captain Rhodes finally lowered his binoculars, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on her longer than on anyone else. He stepped forward, boots striking the gravel with sharp, deliberate sounds, and stopped a few feet from her. The recruits held their breath, waiting for his judgment. For the first time that day, his voice softened just slightly, though it carried the weight of respect. "Well done," he said simply. 2 words, nothing more. But from a man like Rhodes, they were worth more than 100 praises. Alina nodded once, not with arrogance but with quiet gratitude. She did not need applause. She did not need the approval of those who had mocked her. She had already won the only battle that mattered, the one inside herself. The rifle hung heavy in her hands, her arms trembling now not with fear but with fatigue, yet she held it firmly until Rhodes gestured for her to rest. The recruits slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, stealing glances at her as if she were something they could not quite understand. Some looked at her with admiration, others with jealousy, but none dared to laugh again. For them, she was no longer the girl who couldn't handle a rifle. She was the one who had done what none of them had believed possible. She had cleared 15 targets with ease, or at least that was how it had looked to them. To Alina it had been far from easy. But the struggle, the pain, and the silence she had carried within had forged something stronger than any of them could see. As she sat down at last, the rifle resting across her lap, she allowed herself a small smile. Not for them. For herself. When the sun dipped lower and the drills finally ended, Alina found herself sitting on the edge of the barrack steps, the rifle now cleaned and stored but its weight still lingering in her arms as if her muscles remembered every shot. The others passed by in groups, their conversations hushed, yet every so often, a pair of eyes flicked toward her. Some looks carried respect, others envy, but all of them carried the silent acknowledgement of what she had done. The same voices that had laughed in the morning now avoided her gaze, unable to reconcile the girl they mocked with the one who had shattered their expectations. She did not bask in their silence, nor did she crave their words. She was exhausted to the bone, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache, but there was a deep satisfaction inside her that dulled the pain. Captain Rhodes emerged from his office as the recruits were preparing for evening mess. He called Alina's name and every head turned at once. It was not common for the captain to single out a recruit, and when he did, it usually meant trouble or exceptional notice. Alina stood quickly, her legs heavy but steady, and followed him inside. The air in the small office was cooler, shaded from the setting sun, but the tension was heavier than any heat outside. Rhodes closed the door behind them and gestured for her to stand at attention. His eyes studied her in silence, not with the casual skepticism of the morning but with the sharp precision of a man trying to measure something unseen. "You're not here by mistake," he finally said, his voice low and deliberate. "I've seen recruits stumble through this program for years, and very few make it past 10 clean hits on their first day. You cleared 15. His words carried no warmth, no praise wrapped in kindness. They were facts laid out like stones, heavy and undeniable. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Alina's throat felt dry but she answered plainly. "My father was a marksman. He taught me the basics before he passed away. The rest, I taught myself." Rhodes's brow furrowed slightly, and though his expression remained stern, there was something in his eyes that flickered, recognition, perhaps even respect. "Discipline like that doesn't come from practice alone," he said. "It comes from grit. From holding yourself steady when everything around you is pushing you to falter. You've got that." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "But don't mistake today's success for victory. This was a test of skill, nothing more. The real battles ahead will demand more than clean shots. They'll demand resilience, and resilience is forged only in hardship." Alina nodded, not with arrogance but with quiet acknowledgement. She did not need him to remind her that the path ahead was harder. She already knew. Rhodes studied her for a long moment before dismissing her with a simple nod. As she stepped back into the fading light, the recruits waiting outside looked at her with curiosity, whispering guesses about what the captain had said. Alina offered them nothing. Some truths were best kept within. That night in the mess hall, the usual clamor of voices filled the room, but something subtle had changed. Where before she had sat in silence at the end of the table, ignored or dismissed, now the empty seats near her filled more quickly than usual. A few recruits tried awkward conversation, throwing her questions about how she had done it, if she had trained secretly, if she had some trick. She answered sparingly, her words measured, not out of pride but because she had no interest in boasting. The ones who had mocked her most loudly earlier in the day remained quiet now, their eyes cast down at their plates. In their silence she found more satisfaction than any praise. Later, when the barracks had quieted and the others drifted into sleep, Alina lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. The day replayed in her mind, the laughter, the smirks, the first shot, the silence after each hit, the captain's voice in his office. She thought of her father, wondered if somewhere he had seen what she had done, and felt a warmth rise in her chest. But she also knew Rhodes was right. This was only the beginning. Skill with a rifle was her strength, yes, but the path ahead would test her in ways she had not yet imagined. At dawn, the whistle blew again and the next day's training began. Physical endurance drills pushed the recruits to the brink and Alina felt the ache from the previous day flare in her muscles with every step. Yet she endured, her mind replaying the targets one by one, each mark reminding her of what persistence could achieve. The others had begun to see her differently now, but that did not mean they would accept her easily. Respect earned on the range did not erase the walls built by prejudice. Some still muttered when they thought she wasn't listening, whispering doubts about whether she could keep up in other areas, about whether her precision with a rifle was enough to make her a true soldier. Alina did not respond. She did not need to. She had already decided that her answer would come not in words but in actions. If the range had been her battlefield yesterday, then today and the days after would be new ones. Trials of endurance, of leadership, of resilience. She would face them all the same way she had faced each target, with steady breath, steady hand and steady heart. That night, long after the lights were out, Rhodes stood quietly outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette as he often did. His eyes drifted over the rows of windows glowing faintly from within. He had seen many recruits rise and fall, many who began strong but faltered when the true tests came. But there was something about Alina that unsettled him, something that tugged at memories he had buried long ago of soldiers who had proven themselves not through size or strength but through unshakable resolve. He exhaled smoke into the cool night air, wondering silently if the girl who had silenced 15 targets might one day silence far greater doubts, both hers and the world's. The days that followed tested Alina in ways far different from the rifle range. If precision had been her battlefield before, endurance became her war now. Dawn after dawn, the whistle dragged the recruits from their bunks, and each morning they were marched to the field where sweat became the only language spoken. Push-ups, pull-ups, obstacle courses, and endless laps across the dirt track ground every recruit into exhaustion. For most, the strain was a reminder of how far they had to go. For Alina, it was an entirely new battleground, one where her natural advantage with focus and stillness gave her no shelter. Her body was smaller, her strength less developed, and where the others powered through with brute force, she had to survive with sheer persistence. The first week nearly broke her. She stumbled over the high wall on the obstacle course, her hands raw and bleeding from the rope. Her lungs burned after each sprint, the taste of iron heavy in her throat as she fought to keep pace with the others. More than once she found herself at the back of the line, gasping for air while the stronger recruits jeered quietly. "Guess rifles don't build stamina," one muttered during a run, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. Another laughed, reminding her that hitting targets won't carry you through mud. Their words stung, but Alina had long since learned that pain was easier to bear than doubt. She kept running, one foot after the other, her body screaming but her mind locked on the same lesson that had carried her through the targets. Steady breath, steady will, no matter the storm. Captain Rhodes observed from a distance, his face impassive as always. He watched her stumble, fall, and scrape her knees raw, but he also saw how she refused to quit. Where others cursed or demanded breaks, she picked herself up in silence. Where some leaned on excuses, she pressed forward even if slower than the rest. Rhodes knew what he was looking for. Skill could be taught, strength could be built, but the spirit to endure was rarer, and in Alina he saw it taking shape with every trial she refused to abandon. By the second week, something began to change. Her body, though still aching, adapted to the punishment. Her legs carried her farther before fatigue set in, her arms pulled her higher before trembling, and her lungs no longer collapsed after every sprint. She was not the fastest nor the strongest, but she became the most consistent. Day after day she finished every drill no matter how broken she felt. Slowly the jeers faded, replaced by reluctant silence and in some cases quiet respect. The same recruits who had doubted her began to notice that while some of them gave up halfway or slowed until Rhodes barked them back into motion, Alina never stopped moving. One evening, after a grueling circuit of obstacle runs, one of the recruits, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Jace, fell into step beside her as they limped back to the barracks. He had been one of those who smirked when she first picked up the rifle, but now his tone carried no mockery. "You don't quit, do you?" he asked, his voice half in admiration, half in disbelief. Alina glanced at him briefly, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "No," she replied simply and kept walking. Jace chuckled softly, shaking his head, and though he said nothing more, the small smile tugging at his mouth told her that his opinion had shifted. But respect was not won from all. Some recruits still resented her, not for weakness but for making their own failures more visible. One in particular, a lean and sharp-featured man named Kellen, seemed to carry a special disdain for her. Whenever she faltered, he was quick with a cutting remark, and whenever she succeeded, his eyes burned with silent anger. To him, her very presence was a challenge, an unspoken reminder that his strength meant little without discipline. Alina noticed his hostility but did not confront it. She had no interest in feuds. Her battles were inward, fought against her own fatigue and doubts. The turning point came during a stormy morning when the recruits were ordered into the mud pits for endurance crawls. Rain pelted down, turning the earth into thick sludge that clung to every limb. The recruits groaned, cursing under their breaths as Rhodes barked at them to keep moving. Alina's arms burned as she dragged herself forward, her chest pressing against the cold, wet ground with every inch gained. Halfway through, Jace's foot slipped, and he landed face first in the mud, groaning in pain. The others pushed on, too consumed by their own struggle to care. But Alina, already struggling to keep her pace, stopped just long enough to grab his arm and pull. Together, with her strength straining to its limits, they crawled side by side until they made it through. When they emerged, covered in mud and gasping for air, Rhodes's eyes lingered on her longer than anyone else. He did not speak, but his silence was no longer indifferent. It was acknowledgement. Jace, spitting mud from his mouth, gave her a tired grin. "You could have left me," he said between breaths. "But you didn't." Alina only shrugged, wiping mud from her face. "We all finish," she said quietly, and that was the end of it. That night, the barracks buzzed with murmurs again, but this time they were not whispers of disbelief. They were stories, about the girl who not only hit 15 targets but also pulled Jace out of the mud. Some said she was tougher than she looked, others said she was stubborn enough to drag herself through anything. For Alina, none of it mattered. She was too tired to care about their words. Yet as she lay in her bunk, her muscles aching but her heart steady, she knew that a shift had begun. No longer was she fighting only to prove she belonged. Now, without meaning to, she was becoming someone the others looked toward when their own strength faltered, the days turned into weeks, and with every passing sunrise, the training grew harsher. The recruits were no longer simply being shaped as individuals, they were being forged into units. Captain Rhodes shifted the drills from solitary endurance to group challenges, exercises that tested not only stamina but trust, coordination, and leadership. For some, it was a relief they no longer carried the burden alone. For others, it became a new battlefield because working as a team demanded humility, patience, and respect for those they might have once despised. Alina found herself at the center of this change, not because she sought the role, but because others began to turn toward her without realizing it. It started with the rope bridge exercise. The recruits were divided into small groups and ordered to cross a swaying bridge strung high over a rocky ravine. The bridge was unstable, its planks slick with rain from the night before, and the wind whipped across it with cruel force. Many hesitated, fear paralyzing them as Rhodes barked orders from the far side. Alina's group stood frozen for too long until she stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice, didn't order them like Rhodes would. Instead, she moved first, her hands gripping the rope steady, her steps deliberate. Her calm seemed to bleed into the others, and one by one they followed. When one recruit froze in the middle, too terrified to move, Alina reached back, her voice steady but firm. "Eyes on me." One step, then another. "Don't think about the fall." Slowly, with her guiding presence, he crossed. By the time they reached the other side, no one was speaking, but their eyes said enough. She had led them through when fear might have broken them. Word of moments like these spread quickly. Jace, once skeptical, became one of her strongest supporters, often taking her side in group debates or drills. Others, even those who had mocked her before, began to fall in line, not with obedience forced by authority but with trust earned through action. Yet not all were willing to accept her rise. Kellen, sharp-eyed and bitter, grew colder with each day. Where others saw her persistence as strength, he saw it as a threat. He had long relied on his speed and strength to dominate, but now the others looked past him, drawn instead to the quiet resilience of the one he still called the weakling under his breath. The tension came to a head during a survival exercise. The recruits were dropped into the wilderness in small groups and ordered to find their way back to camp using only a compass, minimal supplies and teamwork. Alina's group included Jace, 2 others and Kellen. From the beginning the clash was inevitable. Kellen insisted on leading, striding ahead with confidence that bordered on arrogance, but his chosen path quickly led them into a dense thicket where progress slowed to a crawl. When Alina suggested a different route, using landmarks and careful pacing, he scoffed, accusing her of undermining him. The others exchanged uneasy glances, torn between following brute confidence or quiet logic. Hours passed, the sun dipped lower and frustration gnawed at their nerves. Hunger and fatigue made tempers short, but Alina never raised her voice. She studied the terrain, adjusted the compass, and when Kellen's path brought them in a frustrating circle, she simply pointed out the evidence, their own footprints crossing the same ground. Even then, Kellen snarled at her, insisting it was coincidence. But Jace spoke up, his voice firm, telling the group to follow Alina instead. Reluctantly the others agreed. Kellen trailed at the back, seething. It was Alina who guided them out of the thickets, who found the stream that led toward camp, and who rationed their supplies carefully when the others would have consumed everything too quickly. She said little, but every choice carried them closer to safety. By the time they stumbled back into camp, mud-caked and exhausted, the group knew who had truly led them. Rhodes observed their arrival with his usual stern silence, but Alina saw the faintest flicker of approval in his eyes. Kellen, however, glared at her with a bitterness that needed no words. That night in the barracks the air was heavy with whispers. Some praised Alina openly, clapping her on the shoulder and thanking her for guiding them. Others marveled at how she always seemed to know the way forward, not with arrogance but with steady conviction. Kellen sat in silence, sharpening his knife with long, deliberate strokes, his eyes fixed on her with a simmering resentment that did not fade. Alina noticed, but she did not respond. She had no need to fight his hostility with words. She trusted that time and truth would speak louder than he ever could. The next morning, Rhodes called the recruits together for an announcement. The training was moving into its final phase, combat simulations. They would no longer be firing at wooden targets or crawling through mud as punishment. Now they would be split into squads and tested in war games designed to mimic the chaos of battle. Strategy, leadership, and resilience would matter more than brute strength. The news sent ripples of excitement and fear through the ranks. For Alina, it was not excitement she felt, nor fear, but a steady determination. She knew this was where everything she had endured, every sneer, every struggle, every shot, every step through the mud, would converge. That night, as the camp quieted, she sat alone outside beneath the stars. The air was cool and the sound of distant crickets filled the silence. She thought again of her father, of the way he once told her that the rifle was only part of the battle, that the true fight was in the choices made when the world turned against you. She knew that the days ahead would test not just her aim, not just her endurance, but her ability to guide others through the storm. For the first time she allowed herself to wonder, not if she could survive the final trials, but if she could lead others through them. The thought both scared and strengthened her. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the stars remind her that even in the vastness of doubt, there was always light to guide the way. The first day of combat simulations arrived under a sky streaked with gray, the kind of morning where the air itself felt heavy, as though the earth was warning them of the trials ahead. The recruits were divided into squads, each tasked with capturing a flagged outpost on the far side of the forest. Blanks replaced live ammunition, but the sting of failure would still cut deep, for Rhodes had made it clear. The exercise was not about hitting targets but about surviving as a unit, adapting to chaos, and following a leader who could see beyond the noise. Alina found herself assigned as second-in-command to Jace, a decision Rhodes had made without explanation. Some thought it strange, why not give her the lead after everything she had proven? But Alina understood. Leadership was not always about holding the first position. Sometimes it was about showing strength from the shadows, guiding without demanding control. Jace, for all his newfound respect for her, looked uneasy. "You should be the one leading," he muttered as they checked their rifles, his eyes flicking toward her. Alina only shook her head. "It's not about titles. It's about finishing." He gave a small nod, trusting her words. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches clawing at their uniforms, mud sucking at their boots. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, each sound amplified by the tension running through the squad. Kellen was there too, silent but sharp, his gaze cutting toward Alina every chance he got. He had not forgiven her for the survival exercise, and now, with the chaos of combat looming, his resentment burned hotter. She could feel it like a storm cloud at her back. The first ambush came sooner than expected. Another squad, hidden in the trees, opened fire with blanks that cracked through the silence. The squad scattered instinctively, diving for cover, but confusion quickly threatened to overwhelm them. Jace shouted orders, his voice breaking through the gunfire, but panic made some hesitate. It was Alina who steadied them. From behind a fallen log, she pointed out cover positions, signaling with quick gestures. "Left flank, move now," she hissed, her voice firm but controlled. 2 recruits obeyed, shifting positions and drawing fire away. Jace caught her eyes briefly, saw the clarity in them, and echoed her orders louder, bringing cohesion where there had been chaos. The ambush was beaten back, the enemy squad retreating deeper into the woods, and Alina's group pressed forward. But the cost was already clear. 2 of their squad mates were rattled, shaken by the suddenness of it, their nerves frayed. Kellen sneered as they caught their breath. "We barely made it through because some people think they know better than the one in charge," he muttered, his eyes fixed on Alina. Jace stiffened, ready to defend her, but Alina spoke first. "We made it through because we moved as one. That's all that matters." Her tone was even, leaving no space for argument. Yet Kellen's glare promised this was far from over. As they advanced, the forest became a maze of traps and false trails. The outpost was somewhere ahead, but Rhodes had designed the exercise to test not just their strength but their patience. Hours passed, each step heavy with tension, each rustle of leaves sending nerves into overdrive. When they finally glimpsed the outpost through the trees, relief flickered across the squad's faces. But relief was dangerous and Alina knew it. She crouched low, studying the terrain. Something was off. The silence was too deep, the path too clear. She signaled for a halt, but Kellen brushed past her, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. "Cowards wait," he hissed. "Winners act." The trap sprung instantly. Blanks rattled from hidden positions, and smoke grenades hissed across the clearing. Chaos erupted as the squad dove for cover, but Kellen, caught in the open, went down in a spray of harmless pellets, cursing as his vest sensors lit up to mark him dead. The squad was pinned, fear threatening to break their formation when Alina took charge. She moved low through the smoke, her eyes sharp, her mind calm. "On my mark, right flank suppress," she shouted, her voice cutting cleanly through the storm. Jace, trusting her without hesitation, relayed the command and the squad responded. Shots cracked, smoke swirled, and Alina led a crawl through the underbrush to outmaneuver the ambushers. It was grueling, every inch fought with sweat and mud, but slowly the tide turned. One by one the enemy sensors lit up until the last defender dropped back. Silence returned, broken only by ragged breaths. The squad regrouped, battered but intact, save for Kellen who sat seething on the ground, eliminated early by his own arrogance. The others looked at Alina, their eyes wide with something unspoken: trust. She had not asked to lead, but when the chaos threatened to break them, she had steadied them, guided them, carried them forward. By the time they reached the outpost and raised their flag, Rhodes was already waiting. His expression betrayed nothing, but his eyes lingered on Alina. He had watched, seen the choices, the control, the way she had turned disorder into cohesion. "Not bad," he said finally, his gravelly voice carrying across the clearing. "Not perfect but not bad." It was his way of acknowledging what the others already knew. That night in the barracks the atmosphere was different. The squad gathered around Alina without hesitation, asking for her thoughts, replaying the exercise with her as though she had been their rightful leader all along. Jace clapped her shoulder with a grin. "Second in command, huh? Felt more like first to me." Alina shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "A leader isn't the loudest voice. It's the one who makes sure everyone comes back." Kellen sat apart, his face shadowed, his jaw tight. He said nothing, but his silence was darker than words. His resentment had not broken in the chaos, it had hardened. Alina knew then that the greatest challenge ahead was not just another trial set by Rhodes. It was the festering bitterness of someone who would rather see her fail than see the unit succeed. And though she was weary, though her body still ached from the day, she knew the storm between them was far from over. The final trial came without warning. At dawn, Rhodes assembled the recruits on the range, his voice carrying the weight of something different, heavier than the usual orders. "Today is not a drill," he said, his eyes sharp as steel. "Today decides whether you walk away as soldiers, or not at all. You will face everything you've trained for. Navigation, endurance, combat, and above all unity. Fail to finish together and you fail entirely." His gaze swept across them, lingering a fraction longer on Alina, though his expression revealed nothing. The recruits straightened, their nerves taut. This was the test that would either forge them into steel or break them into fragments. They were sent out in squads again, deeper into the wilderness than before, tasked with capturing and holding a fortified position Rhodes had prepared. Unlike previous exercises, this one would last all day and stretch into the night if necessary. Supplies were limited, ammunition scarce, and the enemy was not just one squad but multiple, each fighting for the same goal. Victory would demand more than skill. It would demand resolve. Alina's squad moved cautiously through the trees, the memory of their last simulation still fresh. Jace took the lead as assigned, but his eyes sought hers often, silently checking her judgment. The others followed in quiet trust. Only Kellen lagged at the back, his silence sharper than any insult. The forest tested them with tangled terrain, sudden slopes, and the constant threat of ambush. Twice they were forced into firefights, blank rounds snapping through the air as they scrambled for cover. Both times, Alina's calm voice cut through the confusion, guiding them to reposition, to move instead of panic. Each victory carried them forward, but each skirmish drained their strength. By midday, sweat drenched their uniforms and their supplies dwindled. They paused by a stream, filling canteens, when Kellen finally spoke. "We'd be faster if we didn't waste time second-guessing. We should charge straight for the outpost." His voice was tight, sharp with accusation. Jace frowned, shaking his head. "That's suicide. You saw what happened last time." Kellen's eyes flicked to Alina, cold and burning. Of course he'd say that, he's listening to her. She's the one pulling your strings. The squad stiffened, the weight of his words hanging heavy. For a moment no one spoke. Then Alina met his gaze evenly. "This isn't about me. It's about finishing. If you want to charge, charge. But don't expect us to follow you into failure." Her voice was calm, but her heart hammered. She could see the fury in his eyes, the kind of fury that did not fade but festered. Kellen muttered something under his breath and fell silent, though his glare never left her. As dusk fell, they finally reached the outpost, a battered structure perched on a ridge defended by another squad. The firefight erupted instantly, blanks rattling in every direction, smoke rising in clouds. The squad scattered into positions, adrenaline surging. Jace barked orders, but it was Alina who spotted the weakness. A blind spot along the right flank where the defenders had grown careless. Crawling through the underbrush, she signaled to the others, guiding them into position. Together they stormed the flank, their rifles spitting controlled bursts. One by one the defenders' sensors lit red, until the outpost was theirs. Cheers broke out, breaths came ragged, but the victory was not yet complete. Rhodes's voice echoed in Alina's mind, capture and hold. Holding meant surviving the counterattack that was surely coming. They fortified quickly, dragging debris into makeshift barricades, assigning watch points. Alina's hands shook from exhaustion as she worked, but her mind remained clear. She had not come this far to falter now. The attack came under moonlight. Shadows moved in the trees, and then the crack of blanks shattered the night. The enemy surged, their numbers greater, their fire constant. The squad fought fiercely, but fatigue weighed on every limb. Alina moved among them, steadying nerves, pointing out targets, reminding them to breathe, to hold. She fired until her rifle clicked empty, then reloaded with hands that trembled but never dropped the weapon. The chaos threatened to swallow them whole, until Kellen broke. With a shout, he abandoned his post, charging recklessly into the trees. The enemy cut him down in seconds, his vest lighting up as he fell. His elimination left a gap in their defense, and the enemy poured through. Panic rippled through the squad, but Alina did not yield. She sprinted to the breach, her rifle steady, her voice ringing clear above the storm. "Hold the line. On me." Her certainty rekindled theirs, and together they closed ranks, driving the attackers back inch by inch. The fight dragged on until the night thinned into dawn, every second an eternity. When silence finally fell, the enemy retreating into the trees, the squad stood battered but unbroken. Mud caked their uniforms, sweat stung their eyes, and exhaustion bowed their shoulders, but the flag still flew above the outpost. They had held. When Rhodes arrived hours later, his expression was as hard as ever, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, pride, though he would never speak it outright. He surveyed the squad, lingering on Alina. "You finished?" he said, his voice gravel rough. "Together. That's what matters." His gaze hardened briefly. "Some of you fell because you let pride lead instead of discipline. Let that be a lesson." Everyone knew he meant Kellen, though the man himself stood silent, humiliated, his bitterness now an open wound. The squad exchanged weary glances, their eyes drawn finally to Alina. She had not been assigned their leader, but she had led them all the same. Not with boasts, not with force, but with steadiness, persistence, and a resolve that never faltered. Even Jace, grinning through exhaustion, said what the others were thinking. She's the one who carried us. For a long moment Rhodes said nothing. Then he gave the smallest nod. Maybe so. His voice was soft but undeniable. That night, when the camp was quiet, Alina sat alone by the fire, her body aching, her mind heavy but calm. She thought of the girl who had stepped onto the range weeks ago, mocked for even touching a rifle. She thought of the laughter, the doubts, the voices that had tried to bury her. And she thought of the 15 targets, the mud, the storms, the chaos of battle. She had faced them all and she had not broken. She smiled faintly, not for praise, not for recognition, but for herself, for proving that strength was not measured in mockery or muscle but in the quiet fire of endurance. The embers crackled softly, and in the glow of the flames she finally let herself rest. The end.